Tuesday, June 6th, 1944. A Sherman tank claws toward a massive ancient hedgerow, barely a mile from Omaha Beach. Its steel nose slams into a wall of earth and roots, older than America itself. The tracks grind, and the engine screams. Hitler's Fallschirmjäger paratroopers crouch in the brush, letting the tank climb, waiting for its soft underside to tilt their way. A single Panzerfaust streaks from the tree line. The tank erupts in flames. Across Normandy, it's the same nightmare. 5 weeks after D-Day, and the Allied advance is bleeding out behind hedgerows, so thick they might as well be fortresses. Tanks can't break through, and infantry can't survive long enough to clear them. Progress is measured in yards, paid for in lives. But in the middle of that slaughterhouse, one tanker had enough. He came up with an idea so insane, it just might work. What he built in 48 hours would change the entire campaign. A fix so simple and brilliant that General Eisenhower called it the most important innovation of the war. This isn't the story they teach in school. This is the epic tale of the mad mechanic who gave American tanks teeth.
Here's a pocket of German resistance. It's just south of both of the villages, the little village of San Conchest and the others there. Northwest of Caen. There the Germans are holding up. They've got some dug-in tanks. They've got perhaps a battalion or so of infantry. We don't know how strong they are, but they're holding up stubbornly.
When the 2nd Armored Division and the rest of the Allied force pushed inland after D-Day, they expected open fields and fast movement. Instead, just a few miles from the beach, they hit something no one had trained for. The Bocage, a dense labyrinth of hedgerows, blocking every road toward the key objective of St. Lo. And that's where everything changed. These weren't bushes. They were centuries-old earthworks, some following ancient Roman-era boundary lines, most built up over the Middle Ages. Walls of dirt, stone, and roots 3 to 12 feet high, topped with brush, thorns, and trees. A twisting maze of fields and sunken lanes stretching nearly 50 miles inland. Within hours, momentum was gone. The Allied advance stalled. The tactics that had worked in Sicily and North Africa didn't work here. They couldn't see the Germans, but the Germans could see them. Elite German paratroopers and Waffen-SS units didn't need tanks to stop an American column. All they had to do was listen. They'd hear a Sherman grinding toward a hedgerow and wait. The moment the tank's nose started climbing the embankment and its thin belly armor tilted up, that was the kill shot. A single Panzerfaust or a Panzerschreck rocket, shoulder-fired, point-blank, and deadly, would punch straight through the exposed belly. One hit and the tank was gone. The crew was dead and the column was stopped cold. Instead of armored breakthroughs, the Americans were forced to fight for Normandy, one field at a time, clearing hedgerows by hand, measured not in miles but in yards per day, and paid for with blood. The Allies had the men, they had the tanks, and they had the firepower. What they didn't have was a way through the hedgerows, until one quiet mechanic from New Jersey decided to fix the problem himself. Curtis Grubb Culin Jr. was not an engineer. He didn't come out of MIT or West Point. He was a mechanic from Cranford, New Jersey, a National Guardsman from the 102nd Cavalry who'd worked on cars and trucks before the war. His regiment had started as an old-school horse cavalry unit. After Pearl Harbor, the horses went away. The Army converted the unit to mechanized reconnaissance, jeeps, armored cars, light armor. Redesignated as the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, they went to war as scouts in support for armored units fighting their way off the beaches and into the Bocage. By June 1944, Cullen's world was simple and brutal. Keep vehicles moving, keep tanks fighting, and watch far too many of them die in the hedgerows. He watched the same horror play out day after day. Another Sherman hit, another crew cooked alive. Culin was sick of scraping burnt friends out of tanks. Everyone at the front knew the problem. The hard part was finding a solution. According to historian Max Hastings, the spark for that solution came in a throwaway comment. One day, As tankers were griping about the hedgerows, a GI Hastings describes only as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts supposedly cracked a joke. Why not just weld saw teeth on the front of the tank and cut through the hedges instead of climbing them? Most guys laughed it off. But Culin's ears perked. Whether Roberts really phrased it that way or not, and whoever he actually was, the basic idea stuck in Culin's head. Stop trying to go over the hedgerow. Go through it. From a mechanic's point of view, it made sense. The problem wasn't that the hedgerow existed. The problem was how the tank was meeting it. As soon as the nose lifted, the belly showed, and that's where German anti-tank weapons were waiting. If the tank stayed level and cut into the hedge at ground height, the hull would remain low, the frontal armor would stay toward the enemy, and the Germans would never get that belly shot. The question was how to do it with what they had. Normandy's beaches gave him the answer. Down on the shoreline, the sand was still littered with German steel obstacles, Czech hedgehogs, rails, and barriers that had been meant to stop Allied landing craft. Now they were just scrap. To a mechanic, that wasn't debris, that was material. Culin realized that those heavy steel beams could be cut down and welded into teeth, simple prongs bolted or welded to the front of a Sherman. Driven by 30 tons of tank, those teeth could bite into the base of the hedgerow, tear into the earth and roots, and open a gap without the tank ever having to rear up and show its underside. Culin had the concept. He had the scrap steel. He had access to tanks. That kept getting knocked out in the hedgerows. Now he just needed one thing. The army didn't hand out easily: permission. And that's where the mad part of the story really begins. Culin didn't write a memo or send a proposal through channels. He just brought the idea to the officers directly above him in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. They didn't fully understand it, but they understood the problem. Tanks were dying in the hedgerows every day. So they gave him the one thing he needed most: permission to try. Culin gathered a small group of mechanics and welders. They moved down to the beach, where the sand was still littered with German steel obstacles, the Czech hedgehogs that were supposed to stop the landings on D-Day. Now they were scrap metal waiting for a purpose. They cut the beams apart, trimmed them down, sharpened the ends, and welded them to the lower front plate of a Sherman. 4 steel prongs, no blueprint, no factory, just torches, tools, and a wrecked tank brought back to life. 48 hours after the idea was approved, the prototype existed. The first test didn't happen in a shop, it happened in the Bocage itself. A Sherman with the welded prongs was driven straight into a hedgerow. Instead of climbing up and exposing its belly armor, the tank dug in low. The prongs tore through the bank, roots snapped, and the tank forced its way through the hedge while keeping its armor facing the enemy. It worked. Not in theory, not on paper, in Normandy, under combat conditions. When word reached higher headquarters, a demonstration was arranged for Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. On July 14, 1944, Bradley watched a Sherman with Culin's device rip through the hedgerow, stay level, and keep moving forward. Bradley's response was immediate: build more. Field depots were ordered to produce the device in quantity. Welding crews were pulled off other tasks. Scrap was hauled in from the beaches. Within weeks, around 500 tanks had been modified, enough to equip more than half the Shermans preparing for the breakout towards St. Lo. Troops called it the Rhino, a field expedient idea born from frustration, welded together in 48 hours, had just rewritten the rules of armored warfare in Normandy. The first real test of the Rhino wasn't a demonstration for generals. It was a fight. By mid-July, units equipped with Culin's cutters, including elements of the 2nd Armored Division, 29th Infantry Division, and other formations preparing for Operation Cobra, began using the modified Shermans in live combat. The difference was immediate. Instead of stopping at every field, calling in infantry, and losing men to ambushes, Rhino-equipped tanks simply lowered their guns, throttled up, and punched straight through the hedgerows. On some roads south of St. Lo, American tanks cut 7, 8, even 10 holes through the Bocage in a single advance, something that would have taken days before the Rhino existed. Infantry, who had been pinned down for weeks, suddenly had armored support again. German defensive plans collapsed. Their carefully aligned kill zones no longer worked because the Americans weren't entering through the gaps the Germans expected. They were making their own. A German report captured later summarized the shock. The enemy tanks no longer climb the hedgerows. They break through them. Even German panzer commanders admitted they were caught off guard. They had built every tactic around the expectation that Sherman tanks would always climb and expose their underside. That assumption became obsolete in a single week. The first major operation that fully exploited the hedgerow cutters was Operation Cobra, launched on the 25th of July, 1944. When the breakout began, roughly 60 to 75% of the Shermans and first-line units had Rhinos welded on. It was enough. In the opening phase, the 2nd Armored Division burst through German lines south of St. Lo and advanced 5 miles in the first day, more than they had moved in the previous month. For the first time since D-Day, American armor was moving like armor again, fast, aggressive, unpredictable. Sherman crews now had initiative. They chose where the battle happened. Culin's invention didn't just help tanks survive. It helped break the German line, and once the breakout began, there was no stopping it. When General Bradley saw the combat effectiveness of Culin's Rhino, the order came down that every tank that can mount one will. There was no time for factories, no production lines, or engineering blueprints. The modification was built in fields, barns, orchards, anywhere sparks could fly. Welding crews were pulled off bridge repair and vehicle maintenance. Workshops stripped anything that wasn't nailed down. Thousands of Czech hedgehogs, once a threat to the invasion, were chopped apart and fed back into the war effort as raw steel. Tank depots turned into improvised assembly lines. Teams learned to build a Rhino in just a few hours. Culin personally traveled from unit to unit, teaching welders how to angle the prongs, how deep to cut the steel, how to reinforce the welds so the prongs wouldn't rip off on impact. He wasn't a guest speaker, he was a hands-on foreman. The field modification became a doctrine. Divisions began marking maps not by where hedgerows blocked armor, but by where Rhino tanks could create new routes. In some sectors, American tanks were cutting 6 or 7 fresh breaches in an hour. German commanders were stunned to see armor appearing in places that were supposed to be impossible. By August, the rapid production of cutters outpaced the advance. Tanks sitting in reserve were being modified faster than they could get to the front. Depot officers joked that the only thing slowing them down was running out of captured German steel. What started as a wild idea in a mechanic's head turned into a standardized order across the First Army. And eventually, a permanent modification built into new Sherman tanks coming from U.S. depots. Eisenhower wasn't exaggerating when he later said, "The ingenuity of the enlisted man solved a problem that might have cost us months." The Rhino didn't win the war by itself, but it made the breakout possible. Culin never stayed behind to admire his invention. Once the first Rhino tanks rolled out, he went right back to his unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, doing the same job he'd been doing before: scouting, repairing vehicles under fire, and trying to keep men alive in a landscape built to kill them. In late July 1944, not long after the breakout began, Culin's war ended without fanfare. He stepped on a mine. No firefight, no dramatic rescue. Just a routine movement through a field that had already been cleared, the kind of thing that happened to hundreds of men every week in France. The blast shredded his legs, peppered his body with fragments, and left him out of the fight for good. He was evacuated to England, then back to the States. He would walk again, but never fully recovered. While he lay in a hospital bed, the thing he built kept moving without him. By the end of August, over 5,000 tanks had been modified across 1st and 3rd Army. Tank battalions reported that their losses dropped dramatically once the cutters were installed. German after-action reports recorded confusion and frustration. Their anti-tank tactics simply stopped working. Bradley later credited the device with helping break open Normandy weeks earlier than expected. That translated into fewer American tank crews burned alive, faster advance toward Paris. earlier collapse of German positions in France, and a shorter war for everyone stuck in it. Culin didn't get rich from his invention. He never patented anything. He didn't end up in a Pentagon think tank, and he never wrote a best-selling memoir. He was honorably discharged as a wounded veteran and went home to New Jersey, where he went right back to what he had always done, fixing cars and machinery. He didn't even talk about the Rhino much. When he died in 1963, his local obituary mentioned that he was a mechanic. It did not mention that he had created one of the most influential battlefield inventions of World War II. Most of his neighbors never knew. But every Sherman tank on display today with a set of steel prongs welded to the front, every military history book that mentions hedgerow cutters, every map of the Cobra Breakout, all of it traces back to a sergeant with a cutting torch and a problem no one else had solved. That was Curtis G. Culin. Curtis Culin never asked for credit, but history eventually caught up with him. After the war, military engineers studied the Rhino as a model of field-expedient innovation, a solution built at the lowest level that changed operations at the highest level. It's still taught today at places like West Point and the Armor School at Fort Moore as an example of bottom-up problem-solving done right. By the time the war in Europe ended, Army records estimated that Culin's invention shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, maybe months. A faster breakout meant fewer dead Americans, fewer dead French civilians, and fewer German units escaping to fight again. Efficiency in war isn't just an engineering achievement, it's a human one. If you'd like to support my work preserving the stories of American heroes, drop a like and tell me your thoughts in the comments. Was the Rhino one of the most important battlefield innovations of modern war, or just a footnote in a much larger fight? Whatever your view, I want to hear it below. You'll find official sources, archival reports, and engineering documentation linked in the description. And if you enjoy true stories of American grit, ingenuity, and sacrifice, make sure you're subscribed. We've got more powerful stories coming your way. I'm Matt, and this is the American Military Network. We'll see you in the next tale of American heroism. Thank you for watching, and may God bless America.